In this video, I am going to discuss cartographic elements and design principles. So I'll start by discussing different map elements and symbology through the use of color, typography, and labeling, and then move on to concepts such as contrast, simplification, balance, and hierarchy in map making. Okay, map elements. So you have your title, author, legend, date, orientation, grid, source, and scale. I'd like to start off by saying not all map elements are required in all maps. It definitely depends on where your map is located, whether or not it is a map by itself, or it's in a presentation, or even in a journal publication. So you have your title to let the reader know what they're looking at. The author is the person that creates the map. The legend, in my opinion, which is the most important, helps the reader decipher what is actually happening in the map. And then you have your date that the map was created. The orientation is most often represented by a north arrow. You have your grid, which are going to be your lines of latitude and longitude. Those are generally for maps that include a very large area and not smaller maps like this. And then you have your data source or sources, which are all the places that you gathered your data from that are included in the map. And then your map scale, which is represented as a scale bar or even written out in writing to let your reader know how large of an area they're actually looking at. Okay, so color in thematic mapping is probably the least understood of all the design elements because it's subjective rather than objective. However, there are a few general rules. So blue most often represents water, yellows and tans represent sparse, dry vegetation, browns represent bare land surfaces, and greens represent lush, thick vegetation. In terms of temperature, red usually represents hot or warmer temperatures, and blue represents cold or colder temperatures. However, the most important rule that you need to remember is that the highest proportion is going to have the darkest color. So you can think about it in terms of density. The more particles in a glass, the darker the glass looks. The same is true in color and cartography. So the more or the higher percentage, then the darker the color. There are also a few different interactions that occur between colors and maps. So there can be large differences in the lightness values between light and dark, which creates contrast. You want to make sure that you choose a background that's really light or dark and try to avoid any background in an intermediate color like gray. That way you can more easily distinguish between the data that you want your objects and then the background. Also keep in mind that warm colors appear to jump off the page more than cooler colors, which tend to fade into the background. Also make sure that when you are creating your color scheme that you try to not use more than 6 to 8 different categories at the most, just because it's hard for people to differentiate between the colors. With that in mind, also note that colors can look different depending on the colors next to it. So make sure that your colors are easily differentiated. And I had mentioned in a previous lecture to think about the connotations of color within cultures. And I had mentioned the differences in Western and some Asian cultures with white, black, and red. So make sure if you are creating a map for a culture outside of the United States that you take those ideas into consideration. Okay, in typography. Typography is important and it can even help identify and differentiate different features in a map. So starting off, we have two different major font families. We have serif font and sans serif font. Serifs, if you look at the top right image, they're the little lines that extend from the different characters. So serif fonts will include things like Times New Roman, and they are going to represent your natural features like rivers, lakes, any body of water, mountain ranges, deserts, and so on. And then your sans serif fonts. So sans is without. So without serifs, those are going to be your Arial type fonts, and those are going to represent your human made features, usually the labels and excuse me, labels of cities, countries, towns, and things of that nature. Size is probably the biggest aspect in determining which features are important in your maps. So the larger the size, the more important the feature. As a general rule, the map title should always be the largest font, followed by any text in the actual meat of the map, and then that will be followed by any text in the margins or footnotes, which will be the smallest font. Be careful using bold fonts because those also attract your readers to look at those areas. So make sure that bold fonts are used really only when necessary and then to indicate areas of more importance. Italics aren't really used, but if they are generally used to represent natural features. Do not use underlined text in your maps. One, it's harder to read, and two, you don't want to be the person that is making someone else click on underlined text thinking it's going to take them to some super cool hyperlink when all it is underlined text. Sad day. Halos are lines that surround the text, so it isn't 100% accurate in this slide, but most commonly you will have a black text with a white halo or a white text with a black halo, and that helps create a large amount of contrast and then differentiate between the text and the background, which is particularly important if you have a background that changes in colors from light to dark. So you wouldn't want light text on a light background or dark text on a dark background. So by creating the halo, it kind of allows for both to be there, and then your reader can actually read what's happening on the page. Color isn't used too much to differentiate between features. What I've seen it used for most is if something is very important, then it'll be in red font. But again, make sure that if you use red, take into account anybody that may be colorblind looking at your map. And then what I have seen it used also for is they'll use a different shade of blue with water features. Kerning and leading both have to deal with spacing with letters and lines. So kerning is the space between the different characters, and then leading is the space between lines. So kerning is most important if you are extending the letters in a name of, say, a mountain range, so it can show the extent of the mountain range. Leading isn't as important, but if you have a chunk of text in your map, you may want to decrease the leading length so it takes up less space. In terms of labeling, as a Western culture, we typically read from top to bottom and left to right. So in the top left image with the dot features and then the numbers, so the numbers correlate with the best to worst places to include your label. And because we read from left to right, we usually like to see the object, and then right after that, we like to see the label. So the top right is the best place to put a label in the US and most Western cultures. If you look at the image to the right of that, you'll see the different orientations. So you want to position the labels to be consistent with your reader's perspective. So again, in Western culture, you are going to want to have the bottom of your text be parallel with the bottom of the page, and then we are going to turn it counterclockwise and then have the bottom of the text face the right side of the page. This may change depending on cultures. I know in some Asian cultures they read from the bottom to the top or from the left to the right, so just make sure that you are sensitive to the culture you are creating the map for. Then in the bottom left, you will see how different cities or towns are labeled on a river. In the second part, the part B image, where it says not like this, my assumption is that that is how ArcGIS or some other mapping software randomly placed the points. And then in image A, that's where the map creator moved the labels. So you want to make sure that the labels aren't overlapping any important features. And then on the bottom right, like I said before, in the US and Western culture, we prefer things from the top to the bottom. So you're going to want the label to be on top of the river rather than on the bottom of the river or the road or any line feature really. But also, when it comes to long line features, you can separate out the words. So instead of separating out the different characters like in kerning, you can separate out white and river so that after the river reaches another tributary or a road reaches an intersection, if you have the two different words on opposite sides of the tributary or road, then it kind of shows a continuance, so you know which direction that the river is heading. Also with rivers and linear features that aren't so straight, you can alter the text to kind of flow along with the line. Okay, contrasted maps allows the audience to perceive differences in the map, and it can also capture the reader's attention. So you want to make sure that you have contrast in areas of importance. So contrast is achieved through line texture, value, detail, and color. It is possible to include all four aspects, but it would likely remove some of the map harmony. The thickness of a line is the line weight, and that's often used to create contrast between different labels, borders, neat lines, qualitative and quantitative symbols, etc. Texture or patterns are often there only to indicate different geographic areas, such as the difference between water and land, but it's also used in grayscale. Because you can't use different colors, the texture is a bit easier to understand than different shades of gray. However, using patterns a bit too liberally can detract from the overall message and also be irritating and hurt your eyes. You don't want to look at a map that looks like one of your grandma's quilts. So if you can, please use solid fills and try to not use pattern fills, especially in combination with different colors to describe different trends. In terms of value, so if you remember back from the color theory slide, a value is the level of lightness or darkness. So make sure specifically, again, that you differentiate between water and land, but light has a higher value than dark. And you want to use a variety of values to create more contrast in your map. And last but not least, with detail. So the amount of detail focuses the reader's attention to that area. So make sure that the area that has more detail is where you want your reader to actually look. And in the example on the bottom left of the slide, line A is the simplest and is just a simple black solid line. And then in the second line, it changes the stroke type. And then the third line, it changes the line width. And then if you compare the fourth line to the first line, it changes the color, stroke, and thickness. If you look at the example on the right of Obama's divided nation and how terrible that map is, I'm going to assume the map author forgot that they work for a newspaper and just thought about the online version where they're going to have color, and the Republicans would be represented as red, the Democrats as blue. But they didn't think about that, so then the newspaper was printed, and because it's not even printed in grayscale, so you could slightly tell the variations between the red and blue, it's just one solid color. So here is where you would definitely want to use patterns. So map simplification or generalization removes some of the data that's displayed in the map that isn't necessary for your reader to actually understand what's happening. So when you're thinking about simplifying a map, think about zooming in and out of Google Maps and how the features that you see change. So map smoothing, which is displayed in the slide, thanks to Penn State for their example. So smoothing simplifies a map by removing vertices and line or polygon features. You can also smooth a raster image. So this typically involves taking the average value of a group of cells, and when you take the average of the group of cells, it removes extreme values, which then makes the image smoother overall. Data aggregation, you combine features, again, whether or not they are raster or vector. If you're looking at a map of the US states in Google, and then you zoom out, eventually it will get rid of state borders and only keep the country borders. In raster data, the cells are clustered and combined, and they form a larger grid pattern. And then the value that's left is usually the average value, but you can also assign a different characteristic like the maximum or minimum values. Simplifying a map by elimination is just as it sounds. You simply remove the features. You will often see this with small islands or the amount of roads when you are zooming out of a map again. So you may have a large road network and then you zoom out and you will only see the major highways. So the amount of generalization increases as you zoom out from a map. So a map from a map in large scale to a smaller scale map. And if you remember from a few weeks ago, large scale maps are more zoomed in than smaller scale maps, which allow them to show a larger amount of detail. Large scale, larger amount of detail. If you're still having difficulty remembering which maps are which, think about the map scale. So if you have a relative map scale, such as 1 to 100, and then another map scale of 1 to 1,000, you just replace the colons or the word 2 with a division sign. So 1 over 100 is a larger number than 1 over 1,000, making a map with a scale of 1 to 100 a much larger scale map than a map with a scale of 1 to 1,000. Finally, remember the golden rule: keep it simple, scholar. You want to include all the information necessary to convey your message through the data, but you don't want so much detail that it distracts and overwhelms the audience. Most maps don't need to be 3D or have a ton of fancy fonts or images to communicate your message, so just keep it simple. I have broken down map organization into 2 categories: balance and hierarchy. Map balance involves how the objects in a map are arranged and its impact on the reader. Oops. Images have 2 centers, a geometric center and an optical center. The geometric center is the physical center of the map, and the optical center is the area that your eye first focuses on. Although they're highly correlated, you should aim to arrange the elements around the optical center rather than the geometric center. The arrangement of objects in a map can make it look heavier in some areas compared to others, like being top heavy or right heavy. And there are a variety of factors that can affect the map balance in terms of weight and direction. So the location of an object affects the visual balance of a map in terms of weight and direction. So the center of the map appears the lightest, and then it appears heavier the further it moves away from the center. The top of the map also appears heavier than the bottom half. You can think about object location and its weight in terms of imagining yourself holding a heavy barbell. The closer the barbell is to your body, the lighter it feels. Holding a barbell against your stomach is much easier than holding a barbell out to the side. And holding a heavy object above your head is much easier than holding it down at your sides. I'm sorry, and holding a heavy object above your head is makes it feel much heavier than when you're holding an object down at your size, even though the barbell is the same weight in all cases. Additionally, objects that are isolated appear heavier than those that are near other objects. I think about this in terms of going to a social gathering where I don't know anyone. There is much less pressure standing in a group of people that are already chatting than there is sitting with someone that is by themselves. Shape can also make the map appear heavier, with more regularly shaped objects feeling heavier than irregularly shaped objects. Looking at the map in the example, you probably first focus on Africa and then move straight to the legend. It reminds me of the differences in pressure when you are in a strict, rigid, orderly community with lots of rules than you are in a community that's more free-flowing and relaxed. In terms of direction, the object shape can also create a feeling of direction by creating different axes within the shape. In the example on the slide, I look at the title first. Sorry, in the first map, I look at the title first, and then the bottom two, I look at Africa first. And this is because of an imaginary corner created from the legend. Lastly, the more intricate or odd a portion of the map is, the more it draws in the reader's attention. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Maps are also organized in terms of hierarchy. The more important the element, the higher it is placed in the hierarchy. So maps should be composed that contain the different levels of hierarchy. Thematic symbols are the most important, like the hospital locations in the CDC maps. Then you have the primary elements, including things like the title, legend, labels, other symbols, scale, north arrow, and they are the second highest because they give the reader the context of the map subject matter. Base maps are below that, and they are important because they give the reader the geographic context of the different boundaries and bodies of water surrounding it. Then you have your source and credits, so you know where it came from, and then your neat line, which sometimes isn't even included, which is why it's at the bottom of the hierarchy.